At this point, we're going to study something called the loanable funds market. And the loanable funds market is simply a market where savers and borrowers, come together. And savers are the suppliers of loanable funds, and the borrowers are the demanders of loanable funds. Okay, so a loanable funds market is just a supply and demand market. It's just a standard market with a supply curve that's upward sloping and a demand curve that's downward sloping. And as we know from just basic market analysis and introductory microeconomics, a market generally has price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis, and in the loanable funds market it's no different. And if we go ahead and draw that market graph, we would simply have the real interest rate. Okay, that's the real interest rate on the vertical axis, and we would have the quantity of loanable funds on the horizontal axis. Now, got to clear a couple things up here. You've probably seen by now that the real interest rate equals the nominal rate. Nominal rate. Okay, the nominal rate is simply the rate that you see on your bank sign out in the bank's parking lot, flashing on the sign, mortgages at 4.5% interest. Well, that's the nominal rate. That is not the real rate. You have to subtract out minus the inflation rate, okay, in order to get your real rate. So the real interest rate is the nominal rate minus the inflation rate. So it's the interest rate on the bank sign. You buy a car and the bank charges you 5% interest. Well, that's the nominal rate. You subtract out the inflation rate, which is say 2%, then the real rate that you're paying on that loan is 3%. That's what's on the vertical axis here, and the reason why it's on the vertical axis is because that's the real return to investing, and that is also the real amount that a firm pays to borrow. Okay, so think of it this way. You buy a car at 5% interest. If the inflation rate's 2%, that means in the future you're paying a dollar that is worth 2% less than it is today. In other words, you're actually only paying the 3% on that loan. That's your real price for borrowing is 3%, and that's why this is on the vertical axis here. Okay, so having said that, as I stated before, we have a supply of loanable funds. And the supply curve being upward sloping makes perfect sense, right? So now remember, we're talking macroeconomics here. So this quantity of loanable funds is aggregated for the entire loanable funds market. So these quantities are typically like in trillions of dollars. The U.S. economy is 14 trillion, 15, 16 trillion dollars large. The loanable funds market will probably consist of about 1/5 of that. So you're talking $2-3 trillion in here. Anyway, so at a real interest rate, say of 2%. People are willing, these savers, these suppliers of loanable funds, are willing to say put $1.5 trillion worth of funds on the market to possibly be borrowed. Now, as let me just shrink this up a little bit here, and I'm just going to use little r because that's the convention for the real interest rate anyway. So At 2%, savers are willing to put $1.5 trillion of money on the market to be borrowed. But if you can get say 7% interest, well, then what are you going to do? Well, if you can get a far larger real interest rate after subtracting out the inflation rate, if you can get more money by saving, well, what are you going to do? You're going to forego consumption, and you're going to keep more of your paycheck in the bank to earn interest because you can make more money off of it, right? And so your quantity supplied of savings rises. Now, if everybody in the United States does that, okay, so interest rate rises. If everybody in the United States does that, then the amount of money on the loanable funds market that's available for borrowing will also increase because everybody's doing that with their paycheck. So, say that goes up to, $3 trillion in loanable funds on the market. Okay, and that's why the supply of loanable funds curve is upward sloping. Savers, that's how much you save out of your paycheck. That's what you don't consume and you keep in the bank to earn interest, and you're behind this supply of loanable funds curve. If the real interest rate falls, well, then your incentive to save falls, and you're going to save less out of every paycheck, meaning that your quantity supplied of loanable funds will also fall. Now, on the flip side of this, of course, we've got the borrowers of loanable funds, the demanders of loanable funds. And they also make their decisions based upon the real interest rate. Now, I stated before that this demand curve is like a standard demand curve, demand for loanable funds. It's downward sloping, satisfies the law of demand. Why does that make sense? Well, because when interest rates are high, that means the real dollar that you're paying back for that loan is greater. The cost of borrowing is higher. Think about it this way. You've got 100 people that want to buy a car, and they're willing to borrow money to do that. If you increase the interest rate from, say, 3% on a car loan to 7% on a car loan, well, you're going to get some of those 100 people are going to decide not to buy the car. The cost of borrowing has gone up. So you're going to see the quantity demanded of loanable funds fall. Okay? And vice versa as well. So, make a long story short, on the demand side, if the cost of borrowing, which is the real interest rate, is high, the quantity demanded of loanable funds will be low. In other words, firms will borrow less money. If the interest rate or the cost of borrowing is relatively low, this will entice firms to borrow more money, and the quantity demanded of loanable funds will rise. And therefore, we have a standard market with the price of borrowing on the vertical axis, the quantity of loanable funds on the horizontal axis, and we have a supply of loanable funds, and we have a demand for loanable funds, and the loanable funds market will clear at some equilibrium real interest rate and some equilibrium quantity of loanable funds on the market. Okay, to analyze this further, why is this an equilibrium? Well, because an equilibrium, it simply means that, without any interference from anyone, the market's going to gravitate to an interest rate of R star and an amount of money saved and borrowed of Q star LF. Why is that? Well, assume that the interest rate is above the equilibrium rate. So assume the equilibrium rate is, say, 4%. And assume, however, that the current interest rate, call it R prime, is 5%. Okay? Well, at 5% real interest rate, Well, people want to save more out of their paycheck, so savers save a higher quantity of money out of each paycheck, meaning that quantity supplied of loanable funds in the aggregate is quite large. However, at this high of a price to borrow, which is the real interest rate, at this high of a price, the quantity demanded of loanable funds is low, relatively low, meaning that we have a surplus of loanable funds or excess supply of loanable funds. Well, if banks are sitting on a lot of cash in saving accounts, well, they don't want to sit on that cash. They don't make any money off that cash. Banks only make money when they're lending money. And in order to get rid of that surplus of loanable funds, to get rid of that surplus saving, banks are going to lend that out. Well, the only way they can entice firms to borrow more money is by lowering the interest rate. Okay, so that's why if interest rates are high, the interest rates will naturally fall back to equilibrium. So let's flip that around. What if interest rates are relatively low? So we've got the quantity of loanable funds, we've got the interest rate, supply of loanable funds, demand for loanable funds, and let's put our equilibrium interest rate back at 4%, say. And quantity of loanable funds, I don't know. Let me just make up a number. Let's say equilibrium quantity of loanable funds is $2.5 trillion in the market. Okay, it really doesn't matter. The interest rate's more important. But now let's say that the interest rate on the loanable funds market is only 3%. Okay, so it's relatively low. Well, in this case, you don't want to save as much money out of your paycheck, and so your quantity supplied of loanable funds is going to be relatively low. So saving accounts in banks are going to be depleted. But at this low of a cost of borrowing, firms want to borrow a lot of money for expansion purposes or whatever at that, because the cost of borrowing is so low. Well, then you have a shortage of loanable funds, okay, or excess demand of loanable funds. So banks are they've already depleted savings accounts. They've let all the money out that they possibly can, and they still have firms coming in filing applications to demand funds. Well, you got a lot of people standing in line waiting for something, waiting for loanable funds in this case. A lot of firms that want to demand loanable funds. Well, guess what? The banks can exploit this by jacking up the interest rate. And when they do, they entice people to save more, but they also entice firms to borrow less. And eventually, again, the market will equilibrate at that real interest rate of 4%.